The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was the most significant defeat for Rome since Hannibal's masterstroke at Cannae 220 years earlier. But while Rome had been able to cope with this first tragedy, and eventually will itself to victory in the Second Punic War, Arminius's destruction of 3 legions dealt a critical blow to Rome's long-term ambitions on the far side of the Rhine. One would think that for orchestrating the clever ruse which led to this victory, that Arminius would instantly assume a spot at the apex of the German tribes he had united in resistance to Roman encroachment. However, the battle represented the high watermark of Arminius's career. Rome may no longer have been in a position to conquer Germania, but it was still able to punish the tribes that had rallied against it, and to seek personal vengeance against Arminius himself for turning his back on his Roman upbringing and showing the fragility of Roman power. For the remainder of his life, he faced setback after setback, even seeing his own wife and child captured and taken to Rome as prisoners. With Germania under siege from punitive expeditions that he was powerless to stop, Arminius sought to unify the tribes again. But their alliance against Rome had always been one of convenience, and Arminius proved unable to forge a new coalition. In fact, his efforts would ultimately lead to his death, as rival chieftains assassinated him because they were unwilling to cede power or influence in the fractious and ever-revolving politics of the Germanic tribes. Arminius had saved the Germans from Roman occupation, but he would pay with his life for his attempt to create Germania. Centuries later, in 251 at Arbutus and 260 at Edessa, Rome would again face defeat on a cataclysmic scale. Situated in the crisis of the 3rd century, these battles represented new lows in Rome's long military history, for not only were the legions mauled by foreign armies at a scale unseen in centuries, but even the emperor himself could not escape the devastation. At the Battle of Arbutus, a Gothic army led by King Caniva were returning from a raid into the empire when they were intercepted by Emperor Decius. What should have been a routine victory against a tribal foe weighed down by plunder was instead a massacre, with even the emperor and his son both slain in the battle. For the first time, an emperor had been killed by a non-Roman. It was a fitting symbol of the empire's fading prestige. But just 9 years later, things would get much, much worse. For while it was one thing to see an emperor killed, at least the humiliation could be forgotten once a new emperor was named. At Edessa, however, the Emperor Valerian was captured by Sassanid Persian forces led by Shapur I, and taken back as a prize for the Persian court to mock for the remainder of his life. Rumors stated that he was even used as a lowly footstool for Shapur whenever he sought to mount his horse, and that when Valerian finally died, his flayed skin was stuffed with straw and placed in a Persian temple, so that the mockery could continue. Romans had long thought of themselves as the masters of the world, but the ignominious ends of 2 men who had once been masters of Rome could not but weigh on the psyche of an empire that was beginning to falter as Rome confronted its own limitations. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. Rome had long faced off with foes on its eastern frontiers, and had even seen success against its great rival. But the reorganization of the formerly Parthian states into the new Sassanid dynasty injected new life into an old enemy, and Rome was suddenly on the back foot on a front where it had once been secure. But the Sassanids were not the only opponent to strike against Rome in the fateful year of 260. Over a period of several decades of incursions and settlements, a Germanic confederation known as the Alemanni had seized the Agri Decumates. Though the land was not significant, the precedent was. After sustained raids across Roman lines, this territory was abandoned, and the empire would never return to this corner of Germania. The success of the Alemanni here is remarkable, because records of these tribes do not even exist until 213, and not even 50 years after they walk onto the pages of history, they were humbling the once proud Romans. Like the Sassanids in the east and the Goths in Dacia, a new enemy was appearing, seemingly out of the blue, to challenge the empire when it could least afford it. The so-called crisis of the 3rd century emerged as a consequence of both internal vulnerabilities and external pressures. I have previously discussed the loss of legitimacy and internal factors, so now turn to the emergence of new threats beyond the frontier and the transformation of societies outside the empire. Disparate tribal groups inhabiting the regions of the Rhine and Danube had shaken off their earlier divisions and coalesced into formidable confederations capable of mobilizing substantial forces. Prolonged contact with Rome was the midwife for this transformation. There is a temptation to see the sudden ascent of these outside threats primarily as a result of Rome's decades of disorder, and while the constant civil wars and shuffling of troops certainly made the frontier garrisons weaker, the vulnerability of the empire would mean little if there were no organized outsiders ready, willing, and able to take advantage of Roman misfortune. So, we must seek alternative, supplementary explanations and look at the reasons why, paradoxically, it was not due to Roman weakness that these new threats emerged. Rather, the forging of disparate groups into new coalitions that increasingly defined themselves as an other to the empire, as non-Roman, was a testament to the success of the empire in its foreign affairs, as well as the allure of Roman soft power. The strength of its economy, the market for its goods, and the appeal of its culture. The most clear and straightforward example of this in action is the decline of Parthia to internal divisions after a period of sustained Roman military success under Trajan, and Septimius Severus exposed the weakness of the ruling dynasty. The Parthian system had always afforded tremendous autonomy to regional governors, and one of these, a man named Ardashir, led a successful rebellion that established Sassanid Persia. In seizing the throne, he also laid claim to all the old dominions of Persia that had been lost to Alexander, territory now occupied by Rome. Knowing full well the danger of regional governors with too much power, he instituted a system that was far more unified, making this new state a greater threat. Only 3 decades after its founding, the revitalized Sassanids humbled Rome at Edessa, and then invaded the eastern provinces, even sacking the great city of Antioch in 260. The through line in the transition from Parthia to Sasanian Persia is easy to track, having occurred relatively quickly in a highly developed state that kept extensive records. More interesting, then, is the manner in which the Germanic and Gothic tribes beyond Rome's European borders came to consolidate into ever more coherent groupings that allowed them to challenge Rome on increasingly equal footing. Earlier German disunity was typified in the infighting that led to the death of Arminius. While even at an early date these tribes may appear to us as a unified force, we must recall that written records come from Roman sources that paint over the sharp divisions among the tribes and write them all off as uncivilized barbarians. In reality, these tribal groups on the Rhine and Danube spent just as much time fighting against each other as they did against Rome. Encroachment by the legions represented a new existential threat, but it was still difficult to put aside old hatreds or for chieftains to stomach a coalition that placed a rival in a position of superiority. Rome's policy on these frontiers relied on a divide and conquer model that sought to play up and heighten these conflicts. In the words of Tacitus, "May the tribes, I pray, ever retain, if not love for us, at least hatred for each other. For, while the destinies of empire hurry us on, fortune can give no greater boon than discord among our foes." But, ironically, Rome's continued presence on the frontier helped these communities to knit closer bonds. Importantly, we must note that this was not merely due to Rome as a shared antagonist. Rather, policies designed to stoke divisions over time created the conditions necessary for greater economic centralization, which was accompanied by urban development, and finally, political evolution and cultural transition. Rome's divide and conquer strategy sought to fragment tribal bonds by selecting certain chiefs as friends of Rome. These collaborationist warlords were then called upon to act as the tip of the spear beyond the empire's formal borders, and were rewarded with payment in the form of money, as well as access to Roman markets and education. Whether we call these chieftains allies or clients makes no difference. The use of diplomacy, gift-giving, and subsidies to maintain peace concentrated wealth and power in the hands of friendly leaders, which elevated their standing in the status-obsessed tribal pecking order, where power still boiled down to the number of men a chief could arm and retain. This increased prestige made the collaborators' rule more stable and enabled them to unify larger populations. The influx of wealth in these same communities then encouraged greater economic specialization as the tribes worked to meet the prodigious demands of Roman garrisons. Archaeology shows that traditional tribal modes of living among these allies became outdated as they developed a more urban pattern of life, and nascent merchant classes emerged that satisfied the appetite for Roman goods, even in far-off lands such as modern-day Denmark. Elites were the most avid adopters of Roman culture, a fact we can observe in the shifting burial patterns and grave goods along the Roman frontier. As elite families from different tribal backgrounds came together in these new proto-urban centers that catered to Roman demands, marriage alliances were formed, and old hatreds slowly melted. Germanic groups and Goths alike became more cognizant of their shared cultural bonds, even as they shed some aspects of their heritage in favor of Roman customs. Over time, the fusion of these ideals created new identities. Roman soft power and the appeal of its culture were instrumental in this process, and the archaeological presence of Roman art, as well as the appetite for Roman wine beyond the frontiers, indicate that the relationship between Rome and outside groups was not always antagonistic. Indeed, there seems to be much that the tribes admired about the Romans, hence the willingness of so many to serve as auxiliaries alongside the legions, in the hopes of gaining citizenship. Roman appreciation for the strength of the Germanic warriors was summed up by Seneca. "Who can be braver than the Germans? Who charge more boldly? Who have more love of arms, among which they are born and bred, for which alone they care, to the neglect of everything else? Who can be more hardened to undergo every hardship, since a large part of them have no store of clothing for the body, no shelter from the continual rigor of the climate? Give but intelligence to those minds, and discipline to those bodies of theirs, which now are ignorant of vicious refinements, luxury, and wealth, to say nothing more, we should certainly be obliged to go back to the ancient Roman habits of life." In the highly paternalistic Roman worldview, its educated officer class could provide the intelligent minds to direct the movement of the capable German bodies, thus creating an invincible fighting force. With the benefit of hindsight, the recruitment of non-citizens into auxiliary military units is often derided as short-sighted and a sign of Roman decay. But though this practice did have some negative consequences, particularly in the later empire, it is important to remember that there was a strong rationale for the policy from the Roman perspective. For starters, the auxiliaries were paid lower wages, a critical factor as the salaries and benefits of citizen soldiers grew exponentially as emperors worked to retain their loyalty. In addition, tribal forces hired as mercenaries could be disbanded as soon as a conflict was resolved. This reduced the number of men under arms, something that emperors had to be mindful of in an era when every frontier general represented a potential rival claimant. The auxiliaries and tribal forces contracted as mercenaries were loyal too. Though it is often assumed that anyone fighting for pay was suspect, these forces distinguished themselves time and time again. For example, in Shapur's annals of his victory at Edessa, he records the involvement of Gothic soldiers. That these men would fight loyally for Rome, so far from their own homes, is a testament to their desire to carve out a place for themselves, either within Roman society or as a valued partner outside it. But, in addition to the fiscal and security benefits, those who served alongside the legions became intimately familiar with Roman culture, values, and political organization, heightening the impact of the economic and urbanization trends mentioned earlier. By the 3rd century, the consolidation process had resulted in the formation of large tribal confederations, such as the Alemanni, Franks, and Goths. Though incursions into Roman territory did not begin in the 3rd century, it is at this point that they accelerate rapidly, and that the empire's ability to count on a sure victory in a pitched battle evaporates. When combined with the fact that fiscal issues made it difficult to indefinitely purchase the loyalty of chieftains, and that legions now frequently abandoned outposts to fight civil wars, we can understand why so many of these tribal groups sought to challenge Rome directly. The illusion of the Pax Romana shattered under these repeated forays into Roman territory. In addition to the defeats already mentioned, there were invasions by the Franks into Gaul and Iberia, beginning in 253, as well as a Gothic attack on Greece in 265 that saw Athens itself sacked. Life in the empire was now more precarious than ever, something that is reflected in the precipitous decline of urban centers across the Roman world, and the erection of walls to protect cities once thought safe. Ironically, as these tribal forces united, Rome would fracture. The Frankish invaders were finally repulsed in 258 by the general Marcus Cassianus Latinus Postumus, who, unsurprisingly, was then declared emperor by his troops. But, unlike other generals who received this acclamation, he made no play towards Rome itself. Securing the loyalty of regional governors in Iberia and Britannia, he was content to govern a breakaway state in the western provinces that has since been termed the Gallic Empire. A similar process unfolded in the east, where border provinces broke away in the aftermath of Edessa to form the Kingdom of Palmyra. Under Odenathus and then Zenobia, Palmyra gradually distanced itself from direct Roman control and assumed de facto independence. Like the Gallic Empire in the west, no attempts were made to seize Rome itself, the ruling warlords too satisfied with a piece of the empire to risk defeat by making a play for all of it. Rome had endured countless squabbles for the throne, but each previous claimant had thought of the empire as a cohesive entity. That was no longer the case. It was felt that a distant central government could not protect the frontiers from the threats along the borders. The ascent of its opponents had brought about the nadir of Roman power. But the empire was not yet defeated, and would prove in the coming decades that it still had the ability to evolve. Frankly, it now had no other choice.